The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Mud clung to boots, uniforms hung heavy with water, and the line of exhausted German prisoners moved slowly across the broken road. Some were barely older than boys. Others stared blankly ahead, too tired to speak. No one knew exactly where they were being taken. Rumors spread quietly among them. An interrogation camp. Forced labor. Maybe nothing at all. But the loudest rumor was about food. They hadn't eaten properly in weeks. A small piece of bread shared between 2 men. Thin soup that tasted more like water than anything else. Hunger had stopped feeling like pain. It had become something deeper, a constant emptiness that followed every step. When the trucks finally stopped, the prisoners looked up. Rows of tents stretched across a wide field. American soldiers stood nearby, watching calmly, not shouting. Just organized, almost routine. One prisoner whispered, almost suspicious, "Why are they so relaxed?" No one answered. The line moved again. As they entered the camp, the smell hit them first. Warm food. Real food. The scent drifted through the cold air, something cooked, rich, almost impossible to believe. Heads lifted, eyes widened. Even the guards noticed the change. The prisoners slowed without meaning to. One of the younger men spoke quietly. "That can't be for us." Nobody argued. They were told to sit. Metal trays were stacked nearby, steam rising from large containers. American cooks moved quickly, filling portions with practiced motions. Still, the prisoners stared. No one reached forward. One American soldier, noticing their hesitation, placed a tray down in front of the first prisoner and stepped back. Silence fell. The meal looked unreal. Bread, meat, potatoes, something warm that smelled like home. More food than some of them had seen in months. The prisoner blinked several times, unsure if this was some kind of test. Behind him, the others stopped whispering. The entire row went quiet. One thought passed through all of them at once. This can't be one meal. No one moved, until the first spoon touched the tray, and everything changed. The first spoonful changed everything. At first, nobody spoke. The sound of metal touching trays filled the room. Small, careful movements, as if the prisoners were afraid the food might disappear if they moved too fast. One man tasted the potatoes. He stopped. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but confusion, real flavor, salt, warmth, something he hadn't felt in months. Across the table, another prisoner ate too quickly, then forced himself to slow down, gripping the spoon tightly. Hunger was louder than pride now. Still, the room stayed quiet. No cheering, no razgovors, just eating. An American soldier walked between the rows, watching carefully. Not aggressive, almost cautious. He noticed one prisoner staring at the bread instead of eating it. The soldier paused. "You can eat it," he said calmly. The prisoner nodded, but didn't move. He broke the bread in half, then in half again, saving it. Old habits refused to disappear. Around him, others began doing the same, hiding pieces in pockets, wrapping food in cloth, preparing for the moment it might all end. One young POW suddenly lowered his head over the tray. His shoulders trembled. No one laughed. No one looked away. Even the American cooks slowed down, realizing what they were seeing. Men who had spent so long hungry that a single meal felt impossible to trust. The silence grew heavier, but different now. Not fear, relief. Slowly, whispers started. "Is this normal? Why would they give us this?" Nobody had an answer. The same American soldier returned with a second ladle of food and stopped beside the table. "Eat slowly," he said. The prisoners stared at him, not as an enemy, not yet as a friend, just as someone impossible to understand. For the first time since their capture, the room felt human again, and that frightened them almost as much as the war. The food was almost gone. Trays that had arrived full now showed only crumbs, scraps of potatoes, and quiet hands holding spoons as if they didn't want the moment to end. For the first time in weeks, the prisoners felt warm. and that feeling made some of them nervous. One older POW leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling lamps. The light felt strange, calm, ordinary, like something from another life. Across the table, a younger soldier whispered, "They're feeding us too well." Nobody answered. The thought spread anyway. War had taught them to expect punishment, not comfort. Every act of kindness felt like a trick waiting to reveal itself. An American guard walked past again, carrying a fresh container of bread. He stopped. "More?" The question sounded simple, but no one moved. The prisoners exchanged looks, uncertain. Taking more felt dangerous, like breaking some invisible rule. Finally, one man nodded carefully. The guard set the bread down and stepped away without saying anything else. That's when someone asked the question quietly, almost afraid to speak it aloud. "Why?" The word hung in the air. No one knew if the guard had heard, but he turned back anyway. He looked at them for a moment, then shrugged. "Because you're hungry." Just that. No speech, no lecture, no anger. The answer felt heavier than expected. Several prisoners lowered their eyes. One man suddenly laughed. Not because something was funny, but because the tension had nowhere else to go. The sound broke the silence like glass. Soon, quiet voices returned to the room. Some talked about home. Some remembered meals they thought they would never see again. Others simply sat, staring at their trays, unsure what to do with the unfamiliar feeling growing inside them. Hope. Outside, rain hit the roof softly. Inside, the camp no longer felt like a battlefield, and for the first time since surrendering, the prisoners realized something unsettling. The war might be ending, but they didn't yet know who they were without it. The room felt different now. The sharp tension from earlier had faded, replaced by something quieter, almost fragile. Plates were nearly empty, but nobody rushed to leave. Some prisoners sat with hands resting on their trays as if afraid that standing up would break whatever strange peace had settled over the hall. An American cook pushed another cart through the aisle. More food. Fresh bread. The sound of wheels rolling across the wooden floor made several heads turn at once. One prisoner frowned. "This isn't normal," he whispered. A few nodded. War had taught them that everything had a price. Kindness felt suspicious. At the far end of the table, a young POW stared at the milk bottle in front of him. He hadn't touched it yet. His fingers traced the edge slowly, as if trying to confirm it was real. Across from him, an older prisoner quietly slipped a potato into his pocket. Another did the same with a piece of bread. The fear of hunger tomorrow was stronger than the comfort of today. The American guard noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he walked over and placed a small paper sack on the table. "For later," he said. The prisoners froze. No one reached for it. The guard stepped back again, giving them space. Moments passed. Then the youngest prisoner finally opened the sack. Inside, extra bread. Simple, ordinary. Yet the sight of it hit harder than any speech. One man lowered his face into his hands. Another stared at the table, blinking quickly. For months, survival had meant expecting the worst. Now their minds struggled to understand something else, the idea that they might not need to fight for every bite. Outside, the rain stopped. Light filtered through the windows, softer now. The room filled with quiet conversation. Low voices, careful laughter, memories returning one by one. But not everyone relaxed. Near the door, a thin prisoner kept looking toward the exit, as if waiting for someone to shout, to end the moment, to remind them this was still war. Nothing happened, and that silence felt heavier than any command. Because for the first time, they were beginning to believe the food would come again tomorrow. The hall was quieter now. Most of the trays were empty, pushed aside, but nobody wanted to leave. The warmth of the room felt too rare, too temporary. Outside, the sky had cleared. Inside, the prisoners sat with a strange heaviness, as if full stomachs had finally allowed their thoughts to return. At the end of the table, one man kept staring at his hands. He hadn't said a word since arriving. Thin, pale, younger than most. His uniform hung loosely on him, almost too big. The others had noticed how he ate slowly, carefully, like someone afraid of making a mistake. An older prisoner beside him finally spoke. "You should eat more," he said quietly. The young man shook his head. After a long silence, he whispered, "I'm not used to having this much." The table fell quiet again. Someone asked softly, "Where were you before this?" The young man hesitated. His eyes stayed fixed on the tray. Then the words started coming. Slow at first, almost unsure. He talked about the retreat. Days without proper food. Cold nights, no fire, constant marching. Men collapsing and being left behind because the line couldn't stop. Nobody interrupted. Even the nearby American guard slowed down, pretending not to listen but clearly hearing every word. The young prisoner paused when he reached the hardest part. He swallowed hard. "We stopped counting meals," he said quietly. "It was easier that way." The sentence hit the table like weight. Several prisoners looked down. They all understood. One man across from him gently slid half of his bread closer. No words, just a silent gesture. The young prisoner stared at it, surprised. For a moment, the camp felt smaller. Not enemies or sides, just tired men sharing a moment that felt almost human. In the background, the sound of dishes being stacked echoed softly. The American guard finally spoke. "You'll eat again tomorrow," he said calmly. The young prisoner looked up quickly, searching his face for doubt. There wasn't any. And for the first time since arriving, he believed it might be true. But deep inside, another thought appeared. Quiet, unsettling. If the war really was ending, what would happen to them next? The hall should have emptied by now, but no one moved. Some prisoners kept holding their cups long after the last drops were gone, as if warmth alone was enough to keep them seated. Others stared at the doors, unsure what came next. The young prisoner who had spoken earlier sat quietly, shoulders slightly straighter than before. The bread beside him was untouched, saved carefully for later. Across the room, an American cook began cleaning the serving area, stacking metal trays with slow, practiced movements. The sound echoed softly through the hall, normal, routine, almost peaceful. That feeling unsettled many of the prisoners more than the hunger ever had. One older POW suddenly stood up. The room instinctively tensed, expecting shouting, orders, something sharp and military. Instead, he removed his cap slowly and held it against his chest. He turned toward the American soldiers. No one understood what he was doing at first. Then he nodded once. A simple gesture. Respect. Or maybe gratitude. Silence followed. The American guard nearest the door hesitated, surprised, then nodded back. No words. But the atmosphere shifted. Something invisible relaxed in the room. Conversations began again. Quieter, softer. A few prisoners even allowed themselves to smile, small and uncertain. For the first time, laughter slipped through the air. Not loud, just a short burst from one table, followed by nervous glances, as if laughter itself felt forbidden. The young prisoner looked around slowly. Hours ago, these men had entered expecting fear. Now they were sharing stories, remembering home. One man described the smell of fresh bread from his village bakery. Another talked about a summer field before the war, sunlight hitting tall grass. The American cook passed by again, carrying a small kettle. He stopped beside the table and refilled their cups without being asked. Steam rose in thin white lines. The prisoners watched him walk away. No one spoke for a moment. Then someone whispered, "Maybe it's really over." The words hung in the air, fragile, dangerous, because everyone knew the truth. The war might be ending for them, but the future was still unknown, and that uncertainty settled over the room like a shadow, even as the warmth remained. Outside, evening light began to fade. Inside, men who had arrived as enemies sat quietly, sharing the same silence, no longer filled with fear, but with something far more complicated. Hope mixed with uncertainty, and none of them knew what the next morning would bring. Evening settled slowly over the camp. The mess hall emptied, but the feeling stayed with them. The warmth of food, the strange calm voices, the quiet understanding that something had changed. Outside, the air felt colder. The prisoners were led back toward their sleeping area, boots crunching softly on wet ground. No one pushed. No shouting. Just steady steps beneath dim lamps. Some men carried small pieces of bread hidden in their coats. Others walked with hands in pockets, trying to protect the last warmth from the hall. Inside the barracks, silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Men whispered. Soft conversations drifted through the dark. "Do you think they'll feed us like that again? What happens when the war ends?" No one had answers. The young prisoner from earlier sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the bread he had saved. He turned it slowly in his hands, as if afraid it might disappear when morning came. Across from him, an older POW lay back with his eyes open. "You should eat it," he said quietly. The young man shook his head. "Tomorrow," he whispered. That word hung heavily in the air. Tomorrow. Something they had stopped believing in long ago. Wind rattled the thin walls of the barracks. Some men closed their eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Full stomachs felt unfamiliar. Minds drifted back to memories they had pushed away for months. Kitchens, families, quiet evenings before the war. One prisoner suddenly sat up, breathing heavily from a dream. No one laughed. Several others were awake too, staring into the darkness. From outside came the faint sound of footsteps. An American guard making rounds. Slow, unhurried. The young prisoner listened carefully. No fear, no shouting, just footsteps moving past. And continuing on. He exhaled slowly. For the first time since surrendering, the night felt almost safe. And that frightened him more than anything. Because safety meant thinking about the future. And the future was uncertain. He looked around the room. Tired faces lit faintly by moonlight filtering through cracks in the wood. Men who had marched together, fought together, survived hunger together. Now they lay quietly, waiting for morning. Waiting to see if kindness could last longer than a single day. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, no one truly slept. They simply waited for whatever came next. No horn woke them. No shouting. Just light. Soft morning sunlight slipped through the cracks in the barracks, slowly pulling the room out of darkness. For a moment, many of the prisoners stayed still, unsure if the peaceful silence was real. Then someone moved. Boots touched the floor. A few men glanced around, almost surprised to find everyone still there, still safe. The young prisoner sat up quickly, checking his pocket. The bread remained. He stared at it for a long moment before placing it carefully back inside his coat. Outside, voices echoed faintly. American soldiers talking calmly. The smell came next. Fresh food again. The prisoners froze. Several exchanged uncertain looks. "Again?" someone whispered. No one answered, but the tension returned. Not fear this time, but disbelief. They walked toward the mess hall in smaller groups now. Shoulders weren't as low. Steps were slower, cautious, almost careful not to disturb whatever fragile reality they had stepped into. Inside, the tables were already prepared. Steam rose into the morning air. The American cooks worked quietly, as if yesterday had been completely normal. A guard noticed the prisoners hesitating near the entrance. He simply gestured toward the tables. No orders, no pressure, just an invitation. The prisoners sat. The young man watched as food was placed in front of him again. Bread, warm potatoes, something hot that fogged the cool air above the tray. This time, no one waited as long. Spoons moved sooner. Conversation returned faster. Quiet at first, then slowly growing. One prisoner smiled at something another said. Someone else laughed softly. The sound felt strange, but welcome. The young man finally reached into his pocket and placed yesterday's bread onto the tray beside the new meal. He stared at both pieces for a moment. Yesterday and today. Proof that the food hadn't been a dream. Across the table, an older prisoner noticed and nodded slightly. No words were needed. Outside the window, sunlight grew stronger. Inside, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a place caught between two worlds, one ending, another not yet understood. But beneath the calm, questions remained. What would happen when they left this place? Would they even recognize the world waiting for them? The young prisoner took another bite and looked around the room. For the first time, he saw something new in the faces around him. Not just relief, possibility. And that realization made the silence feel heavier than ever, because tomorrow was no longer impossible. By now, the routine felt real. Morning food, quiet conversation, the sound of cups, chairs, and low voices blending together like something almost normal, almost. But the uncertainty never fully left the room. The prisoners noticed small things now. The way American guards spoke calmly, how the cooks remembered who wanted extra bread, how no one rushed them out after eating. It felt strange, dangerous even, to begin trusting it. The young prisoner sat near the window again. Sunlight touched the table, warming the metal tray before him. Across from him, the older POW watched the room carefully. "You're sitting differently," he said quietly. The young man looked confused. "You look like someone who thinks there will be a tomorrow." The words stayed between them. The young prisoner looked down at his hands. He realized the truth. Yesterday, he had eaten like someone expecting nothing. Today, he was saving energy, slowing down, thinking ahead, planning. That thought startled him. Round the hall, conversations grew louder. Men talked about home without whispering now. Names of villages, streets, families returned to the air like forgotten songs. Then the door opened. A new group of prisoners entered, recently captured, thin, cautious, their eyes scanning the room with the same distrust everyone here once carried. The hall went quiet again. The older prisoners watched as the newcomers hesitated, unsure whether to sit, unsure if the food was a trap. One of them muttered, "This can't be real." The young prisoner froze. Those were the same words he had thought only a day before. Without thinking, he stood up. He picked up a piece of bread from his tray and walked slowly toward the newcomers. The room watched in silence. He stopped in front of the youngest among them and held out the bread. No speech, no explanation, just the gesture. The new prisoner stared at it, confused. Then carefully accepted it. Something shifted in the room. The fear that had clung to everyone began to fade, replaced by quiet understanding. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were helping each other survive. The American guard near the door observed the moment but said nothing. He simply nodded once, almost to himself. The young prisoner returned to his seat, heart beating faster. He didn't realize it yet, but he had crossed an invisible line, from someone waiting for kindness to someone capable of giving it. Outside, the light grew brighter. Inside, the camp felt different again, not because the war had changed, but because the men inside it had, and deep down, many of them began to understand something they hadn't allowed themselves to believe. Life after this might actually exist. The morning passed quietly after that. The newcomers slowly began eating, watching the others carefully, learning without words that this place was different from what they expected. The young prisoner sat back down and stared at his tray. Something felt lighter, not because the war was over, no one knew that yet, but because the fear that once filled every movement had begun to loosen its grip. Around him, voices blended together, different ages, different backgrounds. Men who only days ago would have been strangers now passed bread across tables without hesitation. The American cooks moved through the room again, refilling containers, offering more food. This time, no one hesitated to take it. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the sky. Inside, the hall felt warm. The young prisoner looked at the older man across from him. "Do you think they'll remember this?" he asked quietly. The older POW paused, considering the question. He nodded slowly. "Not the war," he said. "Moments like this." The words settled heavily. The young prisoner looked around the room again, at tired faces now showing hints of peace, at hands no longer shaking as they held spoons, at men who had learned in a single day that survival could look different than they imagined. Near the doorway, an American guard leaned against the frame, watching calmly. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed between them. None were needed. The young prisoner realized something then. The meal wasn't important because it was large or rare. It mattered because it reminded them they were still human. That realization hit harder than hunger ever had. Soon, the trays were cleared. Men stood slowly, reluctant to leave. Some nodded to the cooks as they passed. Others quietly thanked them in broken words. The young prisoner hesitated before walking out. He turned once more toward the tables. Yesterday, this room had been filled with silence and fear. Today, it held something else. Something fragile, but real. Hope. As he stepped outside, sunlight warmed his face. He breathed deeply, feeling the air as if for the first time. The future was still uncertain. The war still existed beyond the fences. But inside him, something had changed forever. He no longer saw himself as someone waiting to survive the next hour. He believed there could be a tomorrow. And years later, long after the uniforms were gone and the war became history, he would still remember that first meal, the one that proved humanity could appear in the most unexpected place.